I'm delighted to welcome you to Personal Conversations, part of the suite of programs which are a benefit for members of Women's League for Conservative Judaism. In the Personal Conversations series, we discuss topics that are in our hearts and minds as Jewish women. It's not about national or world affairs, but about how we each live our lives. I'm Vivian Lieber, Chair of Personal Conversations. The prior sessions in this series may be found and replayed at the Women's League website, WLCJ.org, under the Programs tab, then under the Online Programs tab. Tonight's program title is Discovering Lost Holocaust Family and a Community of Helpers, How a Book, a Film, and Non-Jews in Poland Launched My Journey. This is a first-person story told by our guest presenter, Marcia Ramey, who I'll introduce in a few moments. Our program will run for about an hour and a quarter and is being recorded. It will appear on the Women's League website for viewing in about a week, if not sooner. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce and invite Debbie Kaner-Goldwich to say a few words to us.
Thank you, Vivian. It's wonderful to be together with everyone, and I look forward to hearing Marcia speak. I actually have read some of her travels and some of the story on Facebook and other places that you've published, and it's very special for us when a Women's League member can actually share her story with her sisters all over North America, and there is great representation tonight from many, many people. It is a benefit of your Women's League membership, as Vivian said, and it's very special for us, Marcia, to have you with us. We thank you for sharing with us, and I want to thank Vivian for providing us this opportunity for engagement and for learning. I want to thank Karen Bellina, our staff person who's managing the Zoom, and for all of you who've had a busy Women's League day today, I thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Debbie. Now to introduce the program, let me tell you the backstory of how this story found me and spoke to me. Then I'll introduce Marcia. A Women's Leaguer knew that I was on the lookout for interesting topics for this series. She was aware that Marcia had made a family trip to Poland in search of her father's story as a Holocaust survivor. In advance of that trip, Marcia's sister recommended that she read a book whose author had made his own quest to learn more about rare film footage that was shot by his grandfather. The footage portrayed a town in Poland on the eve of the Holocaust. There were surprises in the book for Marcia that spurred her to more deeply research her own family. As Marcia and I talked by phone, I found that I strongly related to her literal and figurative journeys, as my own parents had escaped the Nazis, but my grandparents did not. That consequential book, which had so intrigued Marcia, became a documentary film in 2021. I saw it with my husband in a Manhattan theater last summer. It has garnered acclaim and top prize nominations and can now be viewed online, and you'll hear more about it from Marcia. I wrote about my experience viewing that film. That was published by Women's League as a Shabbat letter last September. Marcia also did a deep dive into her genealogy. As she explains her methods and findings to you, you too may be inspired to look at your own family tree and its stories. Marcia will put all these elements in sequence and in context for us tonight. So now let me introduce her. Marcia Ramey is the treasurer of Women's League Southern Region. She is a past member of the Sisterhood of West End Synagogue. I'm sorry, not a past. She is a member of the Sisterhood of West End Synagogue in Nashville, Tennessee, and a past Sisterhood president. She had a career as a corporate tax attorney prior to her retirement in 2020. Marcia grew up in Oak Park, Michigan, and raised her family in the Detroit suburbs. She was a member of the Sisterhood of Congregation B'nai Moshe in West Bloomfield, Michigan, where her mother, Ruth, had served as president. Ruth was also on the Women's League Michigan branch board. Marcia now lives in Franklin, Tennessee with her second husband, a native Tennessean, Elliot Garrett. Her daughter, Sarah, lives in Atlanta, Georgia, and her son, Eli, lives in Montgomery, Alabama. Marcia honors her father's legacy through voluntary work as a Holocaust educator with the Nashville Holocaust Memorial and the Tennessee Holocaust Commission. She stays active through hiking, water aerobics, and other activities. Now, there'll be a time at the end of Marcia's presentation for audience questions. Please type any questions into the chat box directly to me, Vivian Lieber. You may find me also under the list of participants on the bottom bar and click my name. And Marcia will answer your questions as time permits. So Marcia, please, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Karen, you can start the slideshow anytime. So thank you again, everybody, for attending this personal conversation. I really consider it an honor to be here with all of you, and appreciate the kudos from everybody. When I was a child, one of my favorite cartoons was Professor Peabody and Sherman. I liked how they went in the Wayback Machine and journeyed through time and their imagination. So I would like you to step into my Wayback Machine and take a journey with me through my family's Holocaust experience, especially my father's. Learn about the book and the movie that inspired my research, hear about my 2 trips, and my new mission in Holocaust education. In addition to you just saying, wow, that's really interesting, by the end of the presentation, I hope that I inspire you to take your own journey to understand and appreciate the full lives of your ancestors, not just the tragedy of their ending. To recover perhaps a lost piece of our history and ourselves, and even allow the past to change your current life or attitude as it has done mine. I'm going to start actually with a clip from the film that Vivian referred to. It was on, you can find it on the US Holocaust Memorial Museum website. It's about 3 minutes in Poland in 1938, and you'll meet 2 men whose stories intersect with mine 80 years after the film. Karen?
My grandfather's face, his smiling 14-year-old face. I would know it like I would know my own face in the mirror. But I've never seen a picture of my grandfather when he was 14 years old.
I think I was always aware that my family had this film. It was always referred to as the Polish film. And we always knew that it had been my grandparents who had taken the film when they were in Poland. But somehow it had never really sunk in that this was August of 1938. And when I realized when the film was taken, there's actually a title at the very beginning of it that says "Our Film to England, Switzerland, France, and Poland, 1938. For the first time, I looked at this film and realized that all of these people were standing in the shadow of what was about to come. When I found the film, I knew immediately that I wanted to try and preserve it. In the end, I chose the Holocaust Museum to deposit it because the facilities were simply better, and the Holocaust Museum would be able to make the film available. By making the film available to a larger public, you never know who might see it.
My dad and I are on the phone, and we simultaneously clicked on the link, and we're watching this, and it was fascinating. It was almost like a time capsule. And at exactly the same time, my father and I see it, when the counter reached 35 seconds, there is my grandfather's face. We both shouted at the same time, "Oh my God, it's Grandpa!" And I could hear my dad saying to my mother, "It's your father." So I get in touch with this Glenn Kurtz. And I said, Glenn, you turned my world upside down today. And he said, Marcy, you've turned my world upside down today, which I wasn't expecting because I didn't realize the importance that this would have for him.
Now that I've sat with Maury and have watched the film with him, when he can identify people and tell us anecdotes about their lives, it's brought the town into memory again as a place of life instead of just a place of death.
I can't believe that I was really yet a kid. My God, I had a mother and I had a grandmother, and people were getting married and bringing forth generation after generation. It's looking back and saying, yes, there was a world.
So my journey also begins in 1938. This is the only picture that we have of my father's family. He's the young man on the right. The portrait was taken because his brother, Meyer, in the middle, was emigrating to Detroit. 6 years after this picture was taken, only my dad and his brother were still alive. So come along and meet the Rangeverts family. On the left is my grandfather, Yechiel, also known as Giel. He was born in 1890, so he's about 48 here. And he's a rather stern-looking guy, and according to Dad, he was a stern guy, very religious. They were Ger Chassids, so they went to the Stiebel there, not a big shul, just a little gathering place. They observed all the holidays very strictly. Kashrut, Shabbat, of course, was a weekly holiday. Grandfather Cleo owned a grocery store, and he also wrote newspaper articles and played the violin. They lived in a town called Moava, which is about 1 hour north of Warsaw by train. At that time, there's a total of 25,000 residents. 30% were Jewish, so about 7,000. Now there's about 30,000 residents, and of course, none of them are Jewish. My grandmother, Leah, is on the right, and believe it or not, my grandparents had a meet cute. They met at the wedding of their older siblings. So Giel's brother, Meyer, married Leah's sister, Gittel. So all their children were double cousins. And the thing that strikes me about Leah, who's about 46 here, is her sad and careworn eyes. And ladies, we know how difficult it is to keep a kosher, observant home, even nowadays with all of our modern conveniences. Imagine what it was like for a family of 8 back 80 years ago. The other reason I think Leah is so sad here, of course, is that her older son is leaving, but also their oldest daughter, Pearl, had committed suicide sometime within the year before that. I almost imagine that empty space behind Giel is where Pearl should have been standing. Sadly, she committed suicide because her parents did not approve of the young man she had fallen in love with. In the middle, in the back, is Chaya. She's about 19 or 20. Then Meyer is the next in age. He is the one seated in the middle. He's only 16 and a half, and he's traveling by himself to Detroit to meet 3 uncles, all brothers of Giel's, and 1 great uncle who already had immigrated to Detroit. Then the next in order is my father on the right, Betzalel Rangeverts at that time, later in life known as Sal Ramey. And Dad was just over bar mitzvah age there. He's about 13 and a half. He would be known as a yeshiva bacher. He went to the cheder and studied primarily Jewish subjects, Talmud, Torah, Pirkei Avot. The language in the home was Yiddish. Of course, they knew Hebrew from davening and prayer. And mostly also knew common everyday Polish in order to be able to get along in the town. My dad loved Shabbat. He talked about the holidays and how the family sang. And his dream at that time was to be a cantor. He had a beautiful tenor voice. The sister next to him is Frimit. She's about 11 or 12. And then the youngest, who's about 8 to 10, is Malka. Now, all the girls did actually go to, a girls' Jewish religious school also, because my grandparents were very concerned about education. So altogether in Moava, between this family, the double cousins, grandparents, aunts and uncles, my father once made a list of 41 family members from Moava that he lost. Next. So, of course, Germany invaded Poland September 1st, 1939, and that was the official start of World War II. Moava, being close to the western side of the country, was invaded very quickly and surrendered on the 10th of that month, and only 6 weeks later was officially annexed to Germany, the day after my dad turned 15 years old. Life changed overnight for everybody whose towns were invaded, but of course Jews the most, with all the restrictions and oppression of the Nazis. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details because I assume all of you know what those kind of experiences were of living in a ghetto, in a camp, etc. Just reflect on how your ancestors' experience may have influenced your life. I think about what my dad had to do to survive, and whether I would have been able to do that, what things he learned, and how he managed to survive. So the picture on the left is a picture of the ghetto wall in Moava. It is from that town's Yizkor book, and I can explain that more later if you like. Dad smuggled out of that ghetto and into the Warsaw ghetto. It was only an hour by train, so he had false papers and was able to do that. The two documents on the right are from the Erosland archives, which I'll explain on the next slide. The first one is when my father was interned in Auschwitz. The Moava ghetto, like many others, was liquidated into Auschwitz in the fall of 1942. Dad arrived on November 24th and was assigned the number 67593. You can see that the very next one, 594, was also a Rangevierts, and that was one of Dad's first double cousins. The second document is a registration of Saal. There's many spellings, many abbreviations, in what was called the Marschule. This is a bricklayer school. It was within Auschwitz, and the Reich was going on a huge expansion campaign, including expanding Auschwitz itself, and they needed skilled labor. So they took just a bunch of these young men and they put them into training to be bricklayers. As it so happened, they were in brick barracks that first winter of 42, 43. And my dad attributes being inside that severe winter with one of the reasons that he was able to survive. Once he finished the bricklayer school the following spring, he was assigned to be slave labor at the IG Farben chemical plant, which was later known as Auschwitz III or Buna. And he was doing that work until January of 1945. Next. So the reason why Dad was moved in January of 1945 is that the Nazis were starting to lose the war. The Soviet army was moving in from the east, and the Nazis did everything they could to keep the prisoners out of sight of the Soviets. So within January of 1945, they moved 60,000 prisoners out of Auschwitz, many by forced marches. My dad fortunately was on a transport train, but he was sent to another concentration camp, Buchenwald. He arrived there on January 26, 1945. And as Vivian said in the introduction, International Holocaust Remembrance Day is marked on January 27th. That is the day that the Soviet army liberated Auschwitz. So my dad was sent to another camp the day before Auschwitz was liberated. The only prisoners that were left in Auschwitz were about 7,000 who were pretty much dying by then. After Buchenwald, the Soviets kept advancing from the east and the Allies were advancing from the west. So Dad was on a death march in April, about 150 kilometers into the interior of Germany. That's about 100 miles. And he was liberated near Hamm, Bavaria on April 23rd, 1945, by the US Army. So there was that millions of displaced persons after the war, not just Jews, they refugees of all types. So the US Army, the Allies, and also the Red Cross set up these DP camps, displaced person camps. They're trying to repatriate people if they could. So Dad was free, but he had no home. He had no family. He had no income. It wasn't a daily struggle for survival because they provided, housing and food, but he was alone and adrift. He very quickly was able to write letters to his brother and one of the uncles, to let them know that he was alive, but also searching for family to see if they had heard if anybody else had survived. He was hoping that all three of his sisters were still alive because they were sent on the same transport as him. He knew that their parents were probably did not pass the very first inspection. So the Allies and the Red Cross set up what's called the International Tracing Service. And they were taking censuses constantly of these camps and publishing lists of both who survived and who had not survived. And of course, all the survivors were checking the lists for family and other landsmen, people from their town. And this tracing service maintained those documents, and they also collected documents from the camps, anything that the Nazis created that they could collect. And now that is what is turned into the Arlson archives. So I was able to get my father's records. They sent almost 100 pages of documents about my father's experience. So Dad kind of languished in the DP camp. I think he just kept hoping that somebody would be home. He did go back to Mława, went to his grandmother's house, and the Polish caretaker who had helped out with maintenance before the war opened the door and said, "What are you doing here? I thought they killed all of you." So obviously at that point, their dad had no desire to return to Poland. He was going to go to America and join his brother, but finally Israel declared independence in May of 48, and he was able to go. So he sent the picture on the left is from January of 48 to his brother. So chronologically, only 10 years had passed since the first picture I showed you, but I think psychologically it was kind of a lifetime for him. To me, he went from a hopeful boy with a family and dreams to a sad man who was alone. So as I said, he decided to go to Israel and fight to know that we would have a country where Jews could always be free. And along with the other flood of survivors, he immigrated in August of 1948. And of course, the picture on the right is taken on the Tel Aviv shoreline with one of his cousins. The ship in the background is called the Altalena. It's a very interesting little piece of Israel history that unfortunately I don't have time to fill you in right now, but you can Google that one, the Altalena. Dad fought in the War of Independence in the Sinai campaign. And he was either a plaster or a bricklayer. It's kind of some debate amongst my siblings and I. But life in Israel was not very easy. It wasn't even as good as life in Poland had been before the war. Um, Dad hated the desert climate, and he was still doing difficult, physical labor. And to be honest, there's also some discrimination against the Holocaust survivors by the pre-war Zionists who had immigrated. The feeling was that if these Jews had been strong enough Zionists, they would have moved uh, before the war and not have had to have gone through it. So finally, in 1953, Dad decided to go ahead and immigrate to America, but because of immigration restrictions, he lived in Canada for 2 years. Next. So finally, in Bezalel Rangeverts met Detroit native Ruth Muriel Crandall in January of '56 with another meet cute at a Jewish singles event. Yes, I love that part. They got married in June. And, by then Dad was almost 32 years old. And I think this is the first even half smile that we've seen in any of his pictures. I think he was very, relieved to finally be with family and to be able to start his own family. And what did these two people have in common with such different upbringings? They both really believe in education. They wanted a family. They were willing to work hard and to be persistent. They had 4 kids in 6 years. And Dad was naturalized as an American citizen just about a month before I was born. Of course, his boyhood dreams of being a cantor were long gone. He lost his faith to a large extent in the war, and he didn't have beyond a 6th grade education. So he still needed to do physical labor, but he became an independent scrap metal dealer. He owned his own business. And I have to think that many of the survival skills that he used to survive the war helped him run his own business. And he was able to provide a very nice middle-class lifestyle for all of us and put everybody through college. And my mom only had to work if she wanted to. Next. When the Holocaust Center in West Bloomfield, Michigan opened in 1982, Dad was amongst the first survivors to start telling their story to visiting groups. And many of these groups were non-Jews, and he loved, telling students the most because he felt he had the biggest chance to change attitudes. He recorded his testimony at most of the major projects, so you can find it on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial, USC, Shoah Project, etc. He also gave interviews to many of the day school students nearby, including my daughter. Dad felt that he had a duty to deny the deniers, that he had to show people, yes, I survived. I personally went through these experiences, and I need to make sure that people understand the dangers of discrimination and hatred and where they can lead. So it's an amazing legacy that he left with these tapes and with the things that he told us about. And I hope that some of your ancestors have left you, at least some kind of either written or taped legacy as well. Next. And of course, the other legacy that Dad left is his actual family. What a difference between this family and the 1938 portrait. Of course, this picture exists only because Dad did survive those 6 years of hell, death marches, and wandering. And he and Mom shept a lot of nachas from all of us. This is the most complete picture from the oldest grandchild's bat mitzvah, my daughter in the white suit. This is in 2002. And the couple in the back row in the middle added 2 more grandchildren before both my parents died. So I just want to give a little quick rundown on the 3rd generation and their accomplishments. My daughter Sarah went into software like her dad and most of her uncles. And in the front row there, my niece Hannah is now a doctor doing her residency, and her sister Melissa is doing urban planning. My son Eli is in the middle there. He is an engineer. The cute chubby boy with the missing teeth, Aaron, he is a Jewish matchmaker. He started an online Facebook group during COVID that now has 50,000 participants. And his brother David has been living in Israel for several years, and he also is in software. So just looking at this and thinking about my aunts and all those cousins in Poland just makes me wonder what was lost from the world from my father's and grandfather's generation. Next. So we're getting a little more current in our journey here, and now we have circled back to the opening clip, 3 minutes in Poland. So Glenn's journey started with finding the home movie that his grandfather made. That was 2009. He met the Chandlers in 2012 and started making trips to Poland for research. And he was able to publish this book in 2014. Shortly after my wedding in 2017, my sister asked my new husband and I to join her and her husband on the Ride for the Living, a fundraising event sponsored by the Krakow JCC. And we agreed. And she recommended that I read this book in preparation for it. And as Marcy Chandler said in the video, this book kind of turned my world upside down. It told me things about my family that I had never known that were a complete mystery to me. So 3 major points. First of all, is just Maury Chandler himself. I had heard about Maury from my dad pretty much my whole life. Maury owned one of the junkyards that my dad, bought materials from. He talked about what a great guy Maury was. They did business all the time. I had no idea that Dad had known him in Poland. I didn't even know that Maury was a survivor. So the second surprise was that in the book, Glenn quotes some of Maury's recorded testimony. And in that testimony, Maury says that Dad was from the same town as him, Nichels. Well, that was news to me. Dad only ever talked about the town of Mowawa. Now, granted, Nichelsky is very close to Mowawa. It's also north and a little west of Warsaw. So the 2 towns are closer to each other than either one is to Warsaw. But Dad never even said anything about this other town. And third of all, in the book, it talks about the biggest business in Nichels was a button factory. And it was owned by a family named Filar, which was my grandmother's last name. So like Marcy, I contacted Glenn and I asked him these questions, and he didn't really know. I mean, he didn't research any of these questions himself. And he invited me to join his, Facebook group and to begin doing my own gathering the threads of history. He said, there's always more to uncover. So I did. I took him up on it. My first stop was a website called Jewish Gen, and that is a kind of a consolidating website with a lot of databases. And my mission was to document the 41 people on my dad's list and to figure out my grandmother's relationship to the button factory. Now, the mystery about Nichels was solved pretty easily because another cousin had written kind of a little self-published memoir. And in it, she talks about her grandfather, who was one of Giel's brothers, being born in Nichels. So all of those boys, my grandfather Giel was born in Nichels, and his brother who married Leah's sister. But it was only those 2 who married the Filar sisters that moved away from Nichels to Mowawa. So all the time that these 41 people, the people in Mowawa, that was all on my grandmother's side of the family. The Rangewertzes were all probably still in Nichels. Next slide. So this is our first trip, 2018, my first trip to Poland. I have to say I was a little hesitant to go. Dad refused to ever go back, you know, based on the treatment he got. His brother went back once and he was pretty traumatized by that visit. And of course, I knew about all the anti-Semitism in Poland throughout the ages, the blood libels, the Crusades, the Vatican silence or probably complicity during World War II. Another cousin said of our great Uncle Jack, who was in the Polish army before immigrating to Detroit, he was a soldier and a fighter, and his hate ran deep. Mine does too. It ain't healthy, sensible, or productive, but it's just who I am. Well, I didn't feel that hatred, but there was definitely ambivalence. But my sister and brother-in-law were going, and so I'd be with family and my husband. It was an organized trip through a Jewish organization. So I felt like it would be pretty safe. And many of the other participants on this activity were also looking for lost family. So before the official JCC event started, we hired a private guide who took us to the two hometowns of Nashelsk and Moava. We found our great-grandfather's house where my grandfather grew up. We found the button factory. There was just one small sign on it in Polish, so I don't know what it said. And we did look for those ghosts in those cemeteries. So you probably all know that Jewish cemeteries were desecrated during the war. The Nazis didn't just want to kill the Jews that existed. They really wanted to wipe out any memory of Jews at all. So they took any of the tombstones that they found and they repurposed them as building material. Now the picture on the left is the Moava cemetery. It was cleaned up by a number of survivors who mainly lived in the US and Israel, the first time in the 1950s and again in the 1990s. So it's got some nice fencing, there's a nice monument and a gate. But the cemetery in the Nashelsk on the right was really just a field. And when Glenn started researching the town and making visits there and gathering other descendants, they partnered with an organization called the Matzeva Foundation, which is the Hebrew word for tombstone. And that is an organization of American Christians, primarily Baptists, that was created here in Nashville, Tennessee. I couldn't believe it. And they were taking trips to Poland to recover Jewish cemeteries and to work with descendants and the local townspeople to clean them up. So the plaque that I'm holding was from their project the year before we came. Next slide. And this is the some friends that we met on our activities. The one on the right was our guide for the days in Nashville and Moava. His name was Pavel, and he actually changed his profession to do these Jewish tours and research. He had been a journalist, but he felt that the Polish press was not open enough, that he couldn't really tell about things or research them in the way that he wanted to. Including this, shortly before we went, the government had passed a law saying that any camps from the war that were in Poland could not be referred to as Polish camps. They had to be referred to as Nazi or German camps. And on the left is a friend of me with my friend Patricia, who was one of the volunteers for the Ride for the Living. The Ride for the Living is a fundraiser for the Jewish Community Center in Krakow. It is a bicycle ride from the gates of Auschwitz to the JCC. So symbolic of going from a place of Jewish death to a place of Jewish life. And the activities included touring the camp the day before the bicycle ride, and then a huge Shabbat dinner on that Friday evening after the ride. all of the volunteers for the JCC and the ride were not Jewish, including this young lady, Patricia. She's about 30 years old, and she has been studying Judaism and made several trips to Israel, and is looking to see if she has any Jewish heritage. And I met up with both of these folks again on my trip last year. Next slide. So kind of around the same time all these events were happening for me, a historian, a researcher named Bianca Stigter, who lives in the Netherlands, was researching a book about the occupation of Amsterdam during the war. And she spotted that same film clip on the Holocaust Memorial Center as the Chandlers. And she was very intrigued, especially with the color segments of, like Glenn, wanting to know more about the people, wanting them to stay longer. And she was able to create a full-length documentary called appropriately 3 Minutes of Lengthening. And she uses only the original footage and cuts and goes back and repeats. Her husband is film director Steve McQueen, who won an Academy Award for 12 Years a Slave, and he was a co-producer on the film. And the narrator is Helena Bonham Carter. So in conjunction with the screening of the film at the Warsaw Documentary Film Festival, she and Glenn organized, along with the townspeople of Nichels, 2 days of events in the town, including a screening there. And they announced it in February of 22, right before Russia invaded the Ukraine. So many of the other descendants didn't feel safe going, but I felt like this was a once in a lifetime opportunity for me to connect with other descendants and get to know more of the townspeople personally. So I took the plunge and went actually by myself on this one, or met up with all of them. Next slide. The reception that we got in the Nichels was really just overwhelming. The activities and the welcome were really kind of stunning to me. So the first event was a rededication of the cemetery. The descendants and the townspeople had funded this beautiful sculpture gate to mark the entrance to the cemetery. And it was huge, many speakers, huge ceremony, townspeople, students, all kinds of government officials. And then the children of the town gave a performance on our common history, a big celebratory lunch. And as Glenn said, it felt like they were bringing the Jews of Nichels back into living memory, not just as a place of death. And just to give you an idea of what was lost from the cemetery, 2 weeks after I came back from the trip, a third cousin sent me this picture on the right. That's my great-grandmother Golda's Matseva. She died December 28th, 1928, and this is most likely from the unveiling of that stone, probably within 11 months afterwards. And it's very impressive. There are many biblical verses on there. I do have a translation, don't have time to go over it right now. That is my grandfather, Chiel, is the first gentleman on the left there. This incredible monument only stood for about 10 or 12 years until the Nazis destroyed it. And it's known in the Nichels that most of the matzevot from that cemetery were used to create a runway. And fragments were later recovered, and some of them are now in a local museum where they also display some pictures donated by descendants. Next page. So these 2 days were really a culmination of the 10 years of visits and research that Glenn did, and then descendants, and then added Bianca, with all the work on both the book and the movie. And there's another organization that they connected with called the Forum for Dialogue, which is an organization in Poland that encourages local townspeople to learn about the Jewish history in their town. So the seventh graders took us on a walking tour of important Jewish sites in town and explained to us what everything was. And then we were able to go in the classroom with them afterwards. So, I mean, this is very unexpected, you know, kind of thing of I really felt at home, and, you know, really have to confront, you know, what the feelings are about Polish people. They were victims too. The Nazis destroyed their communities and they had to rebuild. Of course, many benefited from, you know, removing the Jews, that they got our property or businesses. But on the other hand, it would have been a death sentence to them to help Jews. You kind of have to question yourself, would you sacrifice your family to help your neighbor? It's a kind of untenable, it's unwinnable position. So Glenn did get this question at the film screening, you know, as expressed by my cousin's attitude. And his response I thought was beautiful. He said, grief often looks like anger. We're just two broken communities trying to heal. I try to look at it through the lens of B'Tselem Elohim. There's a bit of, you know, God in each of us, that I can't condemn all of these people's ancestors for what they may or may not have done to my ancestors. The people that I met in Poland were volunteers, guides, translators, historians, teachers, genealogy researchers. They're willing to change and reach out. They need us descendants to act as partners to them. I think that it would be an amazing act of tikkun olam, that if we could repair the world together. Next slide. So these are my new friends from this trip. On the left-hand side, I didn't explain about the mural. We were all standing in front of the mural that was painted on the button factory. That went up in, I believe, in 2019 or 2020. That mural was entirely an initiative of the townspeople, to the prominent ones with me in the picture here. They conceived of it, they funded, they raised the funds, they commissioned the artists, which was an all-female crew, which is very cool, and, you know, got it painted. And they, you know, obviously welcomed us. They were very excited to learn that a descendant of the Filar family that had owned that factory was there, although I don't know the exact connection yet, still for more research. And they actually have invited me and my husband to stay with them the next time that we visit Poland. The gentleman in the middle is a researches Jewish cemeteries, and that picture is from the Warsaw, huge Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. Many of my ancestors are buried there. He, like the other tour guide, had changed professions in order to do this. He was previously the travel agent. And then the folks in the picture on the right, that's in Mława, and three of them work for the local historical society, which has a very small Jewish collection, but they helped me do a little bit of research and connected me to the guy. That's a great Route 66 shirt that he's got on. He is a volunteer with just a local kind of history club, but all kinds of pictures of Mława from 1910 through 1940, and walked me around the streets of the Jewish that had been part of the Jewish ghetto. Next. So our trip in the Wayback Machine is over now. We're back in Nashville. I'm keeping in contact with my Polish friends through Facebook, but now I've taken my efforts local to carry my father's legacy forward and tell his story. This is a picture of our local Holocaust memorial. It is an outside sculpture garden. It's really an amazing site, and I invite every single one of you, please come visit. I would love to take you on a tour and explain all the symbolism and spend some meaningful time together there. I've also connected with the local university that has a minor in Jewish studies and Holocaust studies. And as Vivian said, also working with the Tennessee Holocaust Commission and hoping to start giving talks at local public schools. I've also reached out to connect and meet more Nishalsk and Mwawa descendants and get them involved, and also cousins. I have lots of ideas for a book and maybe even a movie. So I invite you, I hope, like I said at the beginning, I hope that maybe I've inspired you a bit to undertake your own journey into the past and see how it can inform your future. The easiest way to start is just to write down what you know. If you don't have any videos or written things from any of your ancestors, write down what you do know, any of the names, any of the places. There is an amazing wealth of online resources available. And you will be getting a resource list shortly. And I encourage you to please visit your ancestors' homelands, whatever hesitation or trepidation you might have. Of course, you may not get the overwhelming welcome that I got in the shelves, but you will get a welcome. I'm sure that the Polish people that I met were all very friendly and interested. And also, I encourage you, if you do undertake the search, allow it to change you. My view of the world and of what happened during the war has changed significantly as a result of all this. And thank you all once again for the opportunity to share this story with all of my sisters here today.
Wow, Marcia, wow, I had not heard the entire presentation and the entire story put together like that so beautifully. We had spoken and we went over pieces of it, and I was always, it's complicated. It has so many threads to it that I needed Marcia to repeat some of the threads. They would, and you put it together so beautifully, and I'm so impressed. And I see my own family and your father and how they didn't want to talk about the Holocaust. And now your generation, you had to work so hard to bring this knowledge out from hiding, you and Glenn and other people. And thank God for the Holocaust Museum that preserves and makes public these. And as Marcia said, the film is present, is available, I believe, at no charge.
Yes, it's on Hulu now.
It's also for a rental fee or a purchase available through HULU, Hulu, online as streaming.
Right, Hulu, yes. Yeah.
So thank you. That was moving beyond words.
Thank you.
I want to commend you for everything you've done and for the spirit of your father and your family and what they, may they rest in what a blessed memory.
Thank you. Yes,
wasn't for them.
Yes,
we wouldn't know what lessons they have for us.
Right.
So I would like to
please, I hope there are questions, please.
Yes, as Marcia said, she has a resource list, and we'd like to share that with the people who've registered for this program. Another reason to join our programs. And I'm sure she'll be available if you need a little further information. So with that, I would like to know, I'd like to see if we have any questions. Are people able to?
Can they raise their hands or unmute if there's?
Well, we were looking for questions in the chat, but I don't see it. So I don't know if it's not working. I haven't found it. I'll give you a moment to.
Yeah, or maybe they can, seeing that there's
chat questions.
Well, Sandy's got one, and Sandy was our consultant.
Did we
Southern region.
Call on Sandy just to unmute and talk to us? Sandy?
Oh, she's not. I think maybe Karen. Does Karen have to unmute her?
Sandy, you're muted.
I think, as Marcia already knows, my father was also from Malava, and I am a child from the displaced persons camps. And Marcia, I don't know if you have these books.
Yes, I do.
You
Yep.
do, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And there's one, but I don't know if you could see. These are the survivors from Malava, and this is my father. This was in
Which page?
19.
Which
What
book
page?
is that?
I'll tell you in a second. Hold on.
Okay. Yeah, so the one picture of the ghetto wall is from one of those Yisker books. So let me explain a
Right.
Yisker book. Okay.
That's on page 553, I
Okay.
believe.
Okay, I'll look for it later. Thanks, Sandy.
Yeah.
So let me explain what a Yisker book is. After the, we all know Yisker is the memory, the anniversary of when people died. So after the war, a lot of the survivors, they organized themselves or reorganized what's called Landsmannschaften, which is like a hometown social aid society. And many of them collected memories. Basically, they just told everybody they could find that still survived, write down anything you remember about our town, anybody that you knew back then that you think died, or they used these lists from the International Tracing Service, and they published these books. And now Mwaba's books are amazing. It's actually 2 volumes. Unfortunately for me, 3/4 of it is in Hebrew. And, my Hebrew's good enough to daven, but not to read all this. But 1/4 of it is in English. And the English part is actually on the Jewish Gen website. And my grandmother Leah is mentioned in there, and her father's leather business is mentioned in there. And on this last trip, the guy Stava had a picture of my grandfather's leather store, and my great grandfather's leather store, my grandfather's grocery store, and my great uncle's export business that were all right on the main square of Moava. So Sandy, thank you for reminding me, because now I got to get you hooked up with all the rest of us Malawers for our next trip to Poland.
That's
My
great.
pleasure.
I'm not sure if if anyone's having trouble posting a question or even unmuting yourself. Give it a try by hovering. You have to ask. So please, Karen, maybe we could take a
We
moment
did
to.
enable the chat, so
Yeah, they're able to unmute and chat right now. Everybody should.
Okay.
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 All right, well, so maybe I'll explain some more of this might be against the rules here because he's not a sisterhood member and he agreed to be silent, but I'm going to ask my brother Phil to explain the Altalena incident, that ship out in the harbor in Tel Aviv. Do you want to, Phil? All right, maybe not, or maybe he didn't.
Or,
Okay, all right.
I think I'm not sure, Karen.
Oh, there he is. Okay.
Yeah, what did you want to ask, Marcia?
I wanted you to explain the Altalena incident and why that ship was out in the harbor in Tel Aviv in 1948.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I figured out it was the Altalena, I was just absolutely astonished. And what the situation was, if you're aware of early Jewish history, the Etzel was the Irgun and the Stern Gang, the underground that was run by Menachem Begin. And when the state was established, the Irgun wanted to bring in arms to help out the state. And David Ben-Gurion said no. He said there's only one fighting force in this country, and it's the Haganah. And if you bring those arms in, we're going to shell your ship. And they first went to a kibbutz in the north, and then they finally came down to Tel Aviv. And Ben-Gurion placed Yitzhak Rabin and the Palmach on the beach, and they were literally shooting at the ship. And it could have caused a civil war between Jewish brothers. Menachem Begin was very conciliatory, and he gave in, and those arms became part of the Haganah, and they reconciled. But it it was a bad incident, and they finally wound up towing the Altalena out to sea and sinking it so that it wouldn't become a martyr, a place for martyrdom. So very, very prominent and very important aspect of Israeli history. So, yeah.
Thanks, Phil. So that was one of the things that when Phil explained that to me, that I realized of like the sweep of history, how really, our dad was kind of floated along on this whole historical crazy thing that happened for all these years and how it affected everything after that. But really, if you think about it, everybody lives through the sweep of history. I mean, we just all lived through COVID. So, we've got stories to tell too. So
Marcia, to expand on that a little, I did get a question from Erica. She asked about the understanding people have who are familiar with this period in Israel's history, that survivors who emigrated faced social pressure to keep quiet about their experiences in the war. The question is about your father. Did he experience that kind of suppression? And did that impact the extent to which he wanted to share with you?
Wow,
share with family, share with others.
Erica, thank you. That really is a wonderful question. And yes, I do feel that Dad did have that kind of pressure, like everywhere, really. Of course, in Israel, again, it was still a matter of survival. It was such a new country. Everybody had to work so hard. I don't know that they even had time to talk about it. And honestly, too, the survivors just wanted to put it all behind them. Why would they want to talk about it? They just wanted to have normal lives and rebuild their lives. So I'm not sure about in Israel how much he experienced that, because I never got a chance to ask him, never thought of asking him. But I do know that when he did finally come to Detroit, remember I mentioned that he had 3 uncles that were already here. And he always felt some resentment against what he called his, American cousins, that none of them ever asked, about all that 41 family members that died. And so he didn't open up. He didn't talk about it. But then when I started doing the genealogy and started looking at the dates and when these uncles came over and when their children were born, who, were the same age as my dad, I realized that they never actually knew my dad before the war. Because remember, the rest of the family, they were all in Nishelsk, and only, Dad's, him and one brothers, he only had one set of cousins in Moava that were, from that side of the family. So they didn't actually know those 41 people who died. But yes, there was a lot of pressure to remain silent. And it really wasn't until the Holocaust Museum opened in Detroit. And also, I think a lot of you will remember that Deborah Lipstadt was sued in London for libel, for naming in one of her early books, for naming some people who had been prison guards. And that their argument was just denial, that, well, it didn't happen, so I couldn't have been there. And that really spurred Dad on to, look, I have a number on my arm. I went through this. You can't deny I am here. So yes, I need to speak.
Hey, Marcia, do you mind if I say a couple words about Dad in Israel?
No, Phil, I think we need to let.
Oh no, I was just going to say that he used to wear long sleeve shirts to dance in the middle of the summer because he was ashamed of being a survivor. I mean, he was worried that the girls wouldn't talk to him because he had a survivor thing. And there's actually a great movie called Seventh Million by an Israeli historian called Tom Segev that talks about until 1960, the Israelis finally understood when Eichmann was tried, what they really experienced. Before that, they were looked at as lambs that went to the slaughter without fighting back. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you.
Wow. So your father did a real mitzvah I wrote this down when you gave as you were speaking, of his duty to deny the deniers. And also educate other Jews of, the next generation who need to hear the stories too, as the generations go, as time goes on. That's another important aspect. So, we are very grateful to you, Marcia. You've really done us a good service, and I wish you all the best for continuing your research, updating us, and we will distribute the resource list you've compiled. And again, I urge you to also, the documentary film, 3 minutes a lengthening, is an hour and 10 minutes length. It's not a 3-hour documentary. It's very digestible. It's very good. It may win an Academy Award. It's up there. And
I hadn't seen the nominations come out yet.
well,
I know
other
it's
awards. There's
eligible.
various awards.
It's eligible to be nominated. I don't know if the nominations have come out yet.
Okay.
The reviews are really amazing. What's unique about it is that it doesn't have talking heads. All the visuals that you see is from the original 3 minutes that David Kurtz shot. And he is credited as a photographer, which I'm sure it would have blown his mind.
So with that, I want to remind everyone that, as Marcia said, next week is Friday, January 27th is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. That is the date when the Red Army, coming from the East, liberated Auschwitz. And later other camps, and of course the other allies, the America, Brits, and others who liberated other camps coming from the West. But Auschwitz liberation was first. So there are 2 events you could find on Women's League's this week, the newsletter you get each week. It's listed there, and I will give you a brief introduction. You can find all the details and links, and one is virtual program and one is a in-person program. In Truro University International commemorates this International Holocaust Remembrance Day with a webinar on Thursday, January 26th at noon Eastern time. So go to the Women's League's week to find the details and to register in advance for that. Also at the United Nations in New York City, there's an in-person event. It's not virtual, held on Friday, January 27th at 11 a.m. If you know anyone in the area who wants to attend, the registration will close this coming Monday. There is of course, for security reasons, they have a whole registration process. And if they do attend, I believe they have to be there a good hour and a half early for the 11 a.m. Ceremony at the United Nations. So that's worth noting. Now, I want to just, Marcia, do you have anything else on your mind you want to share with us? Otherwise, we will move to our closing with
just gratitude again that that we connected and that so many of you attended today. It feels well worth the effort to put the presentation together. It helps me focus my thoughts as well. So thank you all.
Well, hang in there, because I meant to call on Rabbi Ellen Wollensfield, Women's League's Executive Director. And Rabbi, would you please do us the honor of adding your thoughts about this program and all the related issues it brought up?
So Marcia, thank you so much. It was definitely worth putting the presentation together because it was a fantastic presentation. And I feel like the next time you go and visit the town, we should bring some of your sisters with you so we can share the experience with you as well, because it was so very moving. And Vivian, you seem to outdo yourself each time that you have a presentation and the speakers that you get. So yasher koach to both of you. Thank you to my team member, Karen Bellina, who has had a very busy day. Thank you for being here to do everything. And of course, we always structure our weekly
life by the Parsha, the Torah reading of the week. And this week, I have a feeling many of us on this call have probably been studying the Torah portion. I know you do it usually, but even more so this week, because Parshat Va'era is the designated Women's League Shabbat. So if your synagogue didn't do it this week, that's okay, but you may have. But Parshat Va'era is a Torah reading that many of us are familiar with because it's the Passover story. It's the beginning of the plagues, and the idea of the slavery from Egypt and also the exodus from Egypt is in everything that we do in Judaism. When we make Kiddush, we say Zecher LiYetziat Mitzrayim, that we remember because of Yetziat Mitzrayim. We are a historical people. When hopefully I can pronounce it correctly. When I was at JTS in the 90s, I studied a lot with Chancellor Schwartz and Schorsch, but Schorsch would teach us Wissenschafter Judentum, that the historical approach to Judaism. And we study about the Exodus because it's our history. And though, of course, none of us, no matter how old we were not part of Exodus ourselves. But it's important to know our history. And this is our history, knowing about the Holocaust, because it's unfortunate that in the next couple of years, we won't have as many people who have firsthand experienced the Holocaust. Our survivors are dying out, and it's important that their children and grandchildren like Marcia and Sandy here and Vivian tell us their family stories, the stories that they've experienced too. And it's our history. The same thing as Yetziat Mitzrayim was our exodus from Egypt. The Holocaust is our history too, and that we need to remember it and pass it along to our children. So thank you very much for continuing that history and telling us your very personal story. Yasher kochech to you. And I wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom, a Shabbat of peace. And enjoy your Women's League Shabbat if it is this weekend.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you again, Marcia. Thank you, Debbie, for making this all possible. And thank you, Karen, for your support.